Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us again for another Wednesday night Bible study together. And I thought tonight we would take a look at Second Kings. I know that Bible Bowl is going to be coming up really soon. Our kids have probably already been studying that, and maybe you've been studying it with them. So as you read through there may be some things that they have questions about, or you may have questions about, because it is sort of a different time period, a different culture, different circumstances of how they deal with certain things, or maybe just some curiosity questions. So I thought it'd be good for us to kind of just take a look at Second Kings, just in case some of these came up in your conversations with your kids, and at least to give us a little more Bible knowledge. So if you would, go ahead and grab your Bibles, go to Second Kings, and let's take a look at some things.
All right, so we're going to go to 2 Kings chapter 1 and verse 4 for the first one. And let me just forewarn you that we will look at several of these, although all of them will be fairly short. And also, some of them are a little more gruesome as you are reading sometimes the Old Testament, and it's very graphic. So just kind of forewarn you, we will talk about a few of those things in detail. But nevertheless, we have here chapter 1 verse 4, where it says, "Now therefore thus says the Lord, you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die." So Elijah departed. So these are the words that the prophet Elijah said to King Ahaziah. And he was the king of Israel, and he had been seriously injured, if you remember reading, from a fall that he fell from the balcony in his palace. Well, the prophet here, Elijah, is talking about, this bed in which, the king had gone up. Basically, that's because, rulers like Ahaziah, they usually slept on what we would say elevated beds, known as divans or divans. These beds, basically, the only way you could get in them is you would have to climb 2 or 3 steps. The same way is very familiar with, King David of Judah. It says back in Psalm 132 where he was going up to his bed. So it's basically when he says you're going to go up, it is talking about a higher or an elevated bed. The second one we come across is in 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 3, where it says, "Now the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, 'Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?' Yes, he said, 'Yes, I know. Keep silent.'" This is the big scene where Elijah is basically going to leave and Elisha is going to kind of take over. Well, these sons of the prophets, they knew that Elisha had been basically the chosen successor of Elijah. And so they came out to see both of the prophets together as they approached the city of Bethel, and it even mentions a couple other cities. Well, there are several different groups of what we say the sons of the prophets that are mentioned here in 2 Kings. You see it in a couple verses here. You see it in chapter 4 and chapter 6. These apparently are disciples or followers of prophets. Prophets basically such as, Elijah and Elisha. They had assigned maybe prophets to do their work and learn from their example, learn from their instruction. And so you have another terminology sometimes, instead of sons of the prophets, you'll sometimes come across a company of prophets. You may read that like in 1 Samuel 19. They were connected to the ministry of, the prophet Samuel there. And so this is just basically saying there are several, or maybe even some say there were different schools that would teach these things. Maybe Elijah and Elisha had set up. So that's what it's meaning when it says the son of prophets. As you go to chapter 3, at verse 11, it talks about washing hands. It says, "But Jehoshaphat said, 'Is there no prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord by him?' So one of the servants of the king of Israel answered and said, 'Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who poured water on the hands of Elijah.'" So you may say, well, what is the significance of that? Well, modern times, we wash our hands before eating, but we do that more of sanitary purposes. People Bible times, they sort of did the opposite. This verse is probably referring to the biblical practice of washing your hands after a meal. See, they didn't have forks and spoons. They weren't necessarily available to the ancient world. And so people ate with their hands, whether it was using bread to scoop up, meats or vegetables or whatever they may be eating. And so we could think, well, that's sort of a messy process. And so the hands had to be washed when the meal was over. And so water was it was sort of a precious commodity in Bible times. Hand washing water, it may have been caught maybe in a basin or even used several times. And so it makes a reference here of just pouring water or washing the hands of Elijah. We're going to stay in chapter 3. We're going to go down to verse 27. We see what we would call a shocking sacrifice, something very disturbing to us. So it says, and he took the eldest son who would have reigned in his place and offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation among Israel, and so they departed from him and returned to their own land. So again, as you recall the story, Moab, it was about to be overrun by the army of Israel. And so the Moabite king used this, what we would say, very desperate measure. He sacrificed of his own son, and he did that to win the favor of his gods. See, child sacrifice was kind of common among the pagan nations surrounding Israel. You can go back to Leviticus 18:21 and read a little bit about that. But the Lord God, he distinctly prohibited the practice among his people. God did not want this to happen. And so, the king of Moab, he probably was, he hoped that this, we would say this detestable act would shock the Israelites into retreating. The sacrifice was made, it says, upon the wall of the city, so everyone would have been sure to see it. And it must have worked, because it says, in verse 37, how Israel basically, they departed from him. We're going to skip a few chapters, and we're going to go down to chapter 8 at verse 9 now, when it says, Hazael went to meet him and took him a present with him of every good thing of Damascus, 40 camel loads. And he came and stood before him and said, Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, has sent me to you, saying, Shall I recover from this disease? So it's kind of, we say, kind of showing off with gifts. So Hazael, he was a servant of Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad was the king of Syria. And when the prophet Elisha visited Damascus, Ben-Hadad had sent Hazael out to him and basically meet him with these royal gifts. So the reason he did that is because the king, he was sick. And he may have been trying to get Elisha to, exercise some of his healing powers on his behalf. Maybe he heard what Elisha could do. In Old Testament times, even small gifts were often sort of accompanied by this great pomp, this great ceremony. And so when he rolls out 40 camel loads, right, that greeted Elisha, probably weren't loaded down with all they could carry. Maybe each camel may have been carrying only a small part of the total gift. We don't exactly know, but either way, we get the feeling that the king is wanting to impress Elisha with this extravagant or this outward display of gifts. We go to the next chapter, in chapter 9 at verse 30. We see the beautifying of the eyes. It says, When Jehu had come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she put paint on her eyes and adorned her head and looked through a window. So you may read this and say, well, that sort of kind of sounds like makeup. I'm not really sure what's going on there. Well, Queen Jezebel, she had heard that her husband, King Ahab, had been assassinated by Jehu. And so she knew that her days were numbered. So she was going to show this great composure by putting on her makeup, fixing her hair, and essentially, I guess, preparing for Jehu's arrival. So this verse shows that, makeup or beauty aids for the eyes of women, they've existed for centuries. This is not just a new thing over the last, 100 years. it's to put it in modern terms, basically Queen Jezebel put her eyeshadow and applied her mascara, if you think about it that way. Eye beautification back in those days would probably be black powder known as kohl. And it basically it serves the same purpose in modern cosmetics. Purpose of makeup is to contrast, especially in the eyes, to contrast the white of the eyes. And when you put dark eyeshadow around them, well, it makes them look brighter, makes them look whiter. You'll read in a couple other places like Ezekiel 23 verse 40, and maybe a little bit of what you read in Proverbs 6 verse 25. Talks a little bit about this custom of beautifying the eyes. We go over to chapter 10 now. In chapter 10 of verse 8, we read very graphic again this idea of this execution by decapitation. It says, "The messenger came and told him, saying, They have brought the heads of the king's sons. And he said, Lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning." So again, you see Jehu, he's still added here. He has assassinated King Ahab. He has assumed the kingship of Israel. And then they had all of Ahab's sons killed to eliminate basically any claims that they would have to the throne. This was not uncommon in this time of day. So it says the sons were beheaded. And not only that, their heads, they piled them up in a heap outside the entrance of the city of Jezreel. This is where King Ahab's palace was located, in Jezreel. This was probably, we assume, Jehu's way of sending the message that anyone who remained loyal to Ahab or who opposed Jehu's, accession of king or the throne would suffer the same fate. Execution by decapitation was unfortunately common in the Old Testament times. David, if you remember back, killed Goliath, and then he cut off the head there in 1 Samuel 17. King Saul was beheaded by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 31. The masters of decapitation were the Assyrians, though. In fact, they have found monuments that have been discovered in excavations and archaeology at their capital city there of Nineveh that depict the heads of hundreds of captives piled out the city gate. We go to chapter 11 now. In chapter 11, we read about the royal coronation. In verse 12 there, it says, "And he brought out the king's sons and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony. They made him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, Long live the king." So this verse I wanted to point that out because it just gives us kind of an insight into this royal ceremony in the Old Testament times. After the royal crown was placed on, this is Joash's head, the king was presented with a copy of God's law. And this God's law was basically given to him to serve as a guide as he governs over the people. He was formally anointed for his task by this oil, as you read, that was poured on his head. So the royal coronation must have been a very, very public affair. People would have been lined up around to see everything. It showed, and this is a way for people as well to kind of show their approval of Joash's coronation with the applause and with the shouting of joy, as it says in the verse that they, were shouting out, "Long live the king." This isn't the first time we've seen those things. We've seen it back in 1 Samuel 10, where Samuel anointed Saul. We see it in 1 Samuel 16, where Samuel anointed David as Saul's successor, and you can keep reading on there. This is a very common practice. Let's go now to the next chapter, chapter 13 and verse 17. It talks about how they declared war. He said to him, and he said, "Open the east window." He opened it, and Elisha said, "Shoot," and he shot. And he said, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance and the arrow of the deliverance from Syria. For you must strike the Syrians at Aphek till you have destroyed them." So what we have here is the prophet Elisha. He is instructing the king of Israel to, open the windows towards Syria, to shoot the arrow in that direction. And this was a very symbolic way of declaring war against, against the enemy, against the enemy nation. And so Elisha, he's also going to assure the king that the Lord would give Israel victory over the Syrians. So that may be something a little bit unique of how they declared war here, something may have not read before. Also in that chapter, just a couple verses later, we read about a miracle. So verse 21, it says, "So it was, and they were burying a man, that suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet." Very, very unique kind of story you got here. Basically, this verse sort of leaves no doubt that the prophet Elisha was one of the most amazing, we may say, miracle men of the Old Testament. As you're reading through 2 Kings, and you're reading about a lot of the things that he did. In fact, I think there were 14 miracles that are attributed to Elisha, including this one that happened after he had been dead, and he's already been dead for several years here. So Elisha's body had probably been wrapped with basically kind of like bands of cloth and placed in this tomb. This tomb was probably made out of solid rock, similar to the tomb you read about Jesus he was buried in. Another body, as you read here, was when it was placed, like basically kind of in a very quick fashion or hurried fashion in Elisha's tomb. It touched the prophet's bones, and God showed how much he honored Elisha, this dead prophet, by filling his bones with the power to bring dead men back to life. I think it's a pretty neat story there. Your kids will probably enjoy as they're reading that one. We're going to skip a few chapters now. Let's go over to chapter 18. We got just a couple left we want to look at. I think 3 more. So this is what we call the deportation to Assyria. In chapter 18 verse 11, it says, "The king of Assyria carried Israel away captive to Assyria, put him in Halal or Halah, and went by the harbor, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Medes." So you got the northern kingdom of Israel here, and they've been overrun by the Assyrians. This was probably a lot of scholars would say around 722 BC. The Assyrians are known to be generally very cruel, very inhumane, and you even look back to chapter 10 of verse 8 in 2 Kings, a little bit about how inhumane they were. We talked about earlier about the decapitating heads and things. They used a different approach with kind of this civilian population of the nations they conquered. So the skilled workers and maybe other members that were considered to be in a privileged class, they were carried away to Assyria. And they were put to work in the king's service, and in the administrators and the craftsmen and the farmers. You kind of remember the story of like Daniel and how it starts off, how Daniel and his friends, how they were carried away and they were taught the customs of Nebuchadnezzar and his men, because they were wanting to be adapted. They wanted to adapt these people into their society. Well, conquered territories were also resettled with people of whether it was different ethnic stock, who were also loyal to the Assyrian king. You look back at the chapter before, in chapter 17, verse 24, a little bit about that. So basically, this was done to keep down rebellion, keep down hostility toward the Assyrian government among the poor people in the land who were being left behind. All right. Also in this chapter, we see what we call a serious miscalculation in chapter 18 of verse 34. It says, "Where are the gods of Hamath and Apad, or Aprad, Where are the gods of Sepharvaim and Hena and Avah? I may be pronouncing those a little bit incorrectly, but we get the point. Indeed, they have delivered Samaria from my hand. So what's going on here? Well, soon after kind of the northern kingdom, or Israel, had fallen to the Assyrians, Judah had now faced an Assyrian invasion. And so the king's ambassadors tried to talk Judah into surrendering by, again, well, just reminding them that the gods of all the territories, well, they had conquered, they had provided, basically the gods they were following had provided an ineffective, been ineffective against any Assyrian threat. And so the idea was, why should the Jews of Judah expect their God to deliver them? Is kind of their thought process. But the Assyrians, well, they had underestimated God's power. Judah's all-powerful God actually wiped out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers with this mysterious plague. And the army basically withdrew without even pressing an attack against Judah. And you read a little bit more of that in the next chapter, chapter 19, verse 35 and 36. Chapter 25, we go, and this is the last one we'll look at today. At verse 7, it says, then they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. They put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him with bronze fetters, and took him to Babylon. Another graphic display of cruelty here, of blinding the prisoners. So Zedekiah, he was serving as the king of Judah when the nation finally fell to the Babylonians in 587 BC. The last thing he saw before being blinded by the captors was the death of his sons. The blinding of prisoners was a very cruel punishment. It was often, this was often sort of a symbol or something of the Babylonians and what they would do, but the Assyrians did it sometimes, and the Persians did it as well. This was done, unfortunately, by searing the pupils with a hot copper plate, or basically by thrusting a sword or a dagger into the eyes. I know that sounds very graphic. You remember even Samson. He was blinded when he was captured by the Philistines back in Judges chapter 16. Again, shows you just the ways of the cruelty that men and armies and nations have always had toward their enemies.
All right, and that's going to kind of wrap up our Wednesday night Bible study tonight as we studied 2 Kings. Hopefully you found some good information there about just some customs, some different things that they did back then, maybe some questions that your kids may be asking as they are studying for Bible Bowl coming up in the 1st of September. So hopefully this was helpful. I'm not exactly sure where we'll go from here, as this will be the last, as we're starting another month in July. But hopefully we'll be back really soon together in person for our Bible classes. But if that's not the case, then we'll continue to post these on Sunday and Wednesday for you to continue opening up the Bible and studying together. So thanks for continuing to watch these.